Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is the podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events and personalities from around the world. When Paul Caruana Galizia was 28 years old, his life seemed to be going in a certain direction. He'd worked as an analyst at Facebook, he'd been a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, and a Marie Curie fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He certainly wasn't an investigative journalist, the job that his mother Daphne had pursued all his life. In Paul's native Malta, Daphne's reporting had earned her a reputation as a tenacious investigative journalist who would take a stand against the country's powerful elites when quite literally no one else would. But Paul and his brothers had grown up seeing firsthand what a life trying to hold the powerful to account was like. As Daphne challenged increasingly influential people, so the threats would mount. On one occasion, the family dog had its throat slit. The family would receive human excrement through the letterbox. Daphne would receive verbal abuse from politicians, which might get echoed in graffiti on public walls in enormous letters. No one would blame Paul for not following his mother into her line of work. That all changed when Daphne was killed. On the 16th of October 2017, Daphne was assassinated in a car bomb. Paul's brother Matthew, first to arrive on the scene, found their mother dead. From then on, Paul's life went on an entirely different path. He committed himself entirely to his mother's world, authoring a book, A Death in Malta, and producing a podcast, My Mother's Murder, for Tortoise Media, where he now works, both of which delved deep into his mother's work and the circumstances around her assassination. Paul was not the only one determined that Daphne's work would live on. An international consortium of journalists began the Daphne Project, aiming to follow up on the stories she started. Paul's work and that of the Daphne Project would reveal corruption at the top of the Maltese state, while 3 people would be sent to jail for Daphne's murder and others remain under investigation. Since then, Paul has continued his journalism work, looking into how Russian money is used to buy power and influence in London, and a series of attempted assassinations in the British capital, all organised by Iran. He joins me today to discuss the purpose and the price of investigative journalism. Paul Caruana Galizia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Faisal.
I want to start by asking you about that decision to follow your mother into journalism. As we mentioned in the introduction, you were aware of how tough life could be when your mother was working in journalism in Malta. After that, when you go through something like that, it's normal for you to think, look, the stakes are literally life and death. Nobody would have blamed you if you just walked away from it. What do you think it was that made you feel, no, I have to continue with this story, even despite the personal risks?
I think what happened is immediately after the murder, my 2 older brothers and I began campaigning, in a full-time way, so traveling around Europe, the world actually, up until it got to a point where I had to return to work because, of course, we weren't earning any money, right. And life did have to start returning to normal. And when we got to that point, it always felt strange to me, the idea that I would, go back to working in an office as an economist or a researcher. And I kind of developed over the campaigning this sense of purpose, this sense, like you said, that the stakes are really high and there is really important work to be done, really important stories to be pursued. There are really serious issues happening in Malta and across Europe.
Yeah.
And I wanted to work on them. And journalism happened almost by accident. It was the summer of 2018. And someone I used to work with before my mother was killed told me, I know someone who's setting up a new journalism company, Tortoise Media. Why don't you go and meet him? And it must have been June 2018. And it went from there, really. And I've enjoyed my previous jobs, of course, but I slightly begrudge the time I spent not being a journalist, because it is one of these jobs that's filled with a lot of stress, anxiety, but at the same time you feel you're doing something useful.
But you didn't feel that before. I mean, you spent, your mother had been a journalist your whole life. You were
Yes.
familiar with what journalism
Yes.
was, and you could have gone into it earlier.
Yes.
There was an anecdote you talk about in the book that your mother used to hire you when you were a teenager to write copy for her magazines.
Yes, in her desperation to get me to do something with myself. I think the funny thing is I really enjoy doing that work, and I privately always did like the idea of writing for a living and reporting for a living. But when I lived in Malta and when my mother was alive, I really had this strong sense that I didn't want to be compared to her, and a really strong sense that I didn't just want to follow her into her line of work, and so that people would say, "Oh, he's just copying her."
Because your mother was very much a public figure in Malta.
That's right, and it felt too obvious to me at the time, and also because she was such a presence in the country and such a figure in journalism in the country, I felt I'd have never been able to carve out my own space. And really, the story of my 20s is a kind of, what am I going to do with myself? What am I going to do? And I tried different jobs, and she was killed when I was 28. And I've now been a journalist for almost 7 years, which is the longest I've held down.
The longest you've had one particular job,
yes,
actually.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's given me great joy and purpose, but also great anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder sometimes that I understand what you mean about wanting to carve out your own space, and then you kind of get pulled back into it.
Yes.
But in a way, you didn't get pulled back into it because of your own choices. I mean, you did choose to do it.
Yes, that's right.
But it was this extraordinary event that propelled you into it.
Yes. So, and I wonder, would I have ended up in journalism if it weren't for the murder? I just don't know. I
mean, you weren't far from it, were you? I mean, you were journalism adjacent.
Yes.
It's quite possible that even without the murder, you might have drifted that way.
Maybe I might have started writing, for a general audience. I might have, continued working in public policy, which was one of my jobs. But I certainly, the murder is what drove me into the specific kind of journalism I do now and the stories I'm interested in. And I don't think any of that would have happened if it weren't for the murder, which is a kind of difficult thing to think about for me personally, because it is a job I love a lot, and I get great satisfaction from it. But it is rooted in this horrific event, which, if I had the power, I'd of course reverse.
You'd reverse the event, of course. I wanted to talk about your mother's story, but before that, I thought we should talk about Malta.
Okay.
Because it seems to me that as much as your mother's story is a broader story about investigative journalism and state capture, it's also quite rooted specifically in Malta and a story about Malta at that period of time, now actually. Paint a picture for us of Malta and what it was like to grow up in this island.
So the first thing to say about the country is it's very small. So literally speaking, 316 square kilometers. When I was growing up there, the population hovered around 400,000 people. So it was on paper quite densely populated, but then there were entire parts of the country which were empty. So I remember going to beaches growing up which were empty. The school I went to was full of, the children of my parents' friends and their siblings, and my brothers were there as well. So it was that kind of place. People really, really knew each other, knew all about each other. It was quite oppressive. And I mentioned this anecdote to you earlier where I remember sitting on a beach with my friends when I was 18 years old and privately thinking to myself, I'm 18 and I already know everyone I will ever know here. And that's when I started thinking about moving away. But before we get there, during that period, the country changed a lot over its modern history. So it decolonized from Britain in 1964, which was the year my mother was born. In fact, her story, it can be told in parallel with the country's, which is something I try to do in the book. And for the 60s, it looked like the country would fulfill the promises it made itself about becoming more democratic, wealthier, that it would respect human rights, that it would work well, and that society would become cohesive. But then in 71, the country elected a very left-wing government, which was the fashion at the time, that newly formed or newly independent states turned east, became anti-West, anti-imperialist.
It's very common. They came out of colonialism.
Exactly. So it was very much that story, closed off the economy to try to grow domestic industry. And that mattered, right? Because those were my mother's formative years. So she grew up in a country where you could only buy one brand of chocolate, which is domestically produced, one brand of toothpaste, not many clothes available. Very closed and very left-wing, but at the same time, very, very Catholic, intensely Catholic. And yet, at the same time, because of its British colonial past, had access to this outside world through British papers, magazines, and so on. And so through that, my mother developed a sense of what things were like in the West, outside the country, which were, of course, very different, right? The 80s in Britain, the late 70s. It was the start of this kind of period of opulence and capitalism and free market democracies. And I was born in 88. The 90s, Malta was going through this process of accession to the European Union. So it started opening up its economy. And this all became clear in hindsight, but it wasn't clear to people at the time that economic liberalization kind of obscured the unreformed political institutions that were working in the country.
Right. Again, a relatively common story.
That's right. So then in 2004, when I was at sixth form, I had just finished school. In fact, Malta joined the EU. And again, it changed. The economy was very open. Suddenly we could travel freely. And we were connected to this bigger bloc. And everyone misinterpreted it as Malta, Malta's end of history moment, the democracy has arrived, an open economy. And no one really paid attention to the fact that we entered that globalized world with these rickety, effectively colonial institutions, particularly a very powerful executive, a very powerful prime minister's office. And that didn't matter didn't matter very much because corruption was always an issue, until 2013, when we voted in a hideously corrupt prime minister and one who really exploited all these weaknesses.
And that was part of the background that led to your mother starting to do these investigations.
Yes, that's right.
And actually causing problems for people in positions of power in Malta.
That's right. So my mother began writing right at the end of the 80s, and she was the first woman to write a political column, the first columnist to write in their own name, because even up until then, there were no bylines in the papers out of fear of violent reprisals. And that carried on really until the start of the 90s. So hers was the first named column, and that appeared in 1990.
That's quite a strange thing for I think a lot of the listeners and viewers to understand, that for most of the period of time that Malta had existed as an independent state, the journalism was done completely anonymously.
That's right.
Precisely because of the fear of repercussions.
Yes.
Violent repercussions.
Very violent repercussions. So there was a period of serious violence in the late 70s and 80s. So partisan violence, church governing party violence, which included bombings, stabbings, shootings, which were state sanctioned. You know, you had effectively what were like groups of thugs, so, you know, paramilitary groups of thugs running around, beating up opposition figures, protesters, including my parents in the 80s. And so the press was very vulnerable to these attacks. In fact, the building of the Times of Malta was burned down, you know, in Valletta, which is a building right next to the Prime Minister's office, by pro-government thugs in the 70s. So it was very much that environment. And that fear carried over throughout the 80s. And there was this real uneasiness about changing it. And another thing, which is more cultural, is in a country like that, where the population was, during this period, going from 300,000 to 400,000, journalists had to, or rather found themselves in situations where they had to write about people they knew, maybe extended family even, people they grew up with, went to school with.
Right.
Or at least people they often bumped into in Valletta or wherever else. And not many people were willing to go there because, you know, in a small place, all social relations seem to matter more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
if you
of
fall
course.
out with one person
Of course.
in a city, that doesn't matter as much
Yeah.
as falling out with your neighbor in a very small
You fall out
place.
with your neighbour, your kids see each other
Yes,
at school.
that's right. And that really shaped the way people did journalism. And I think my mother made this very conscious decision that if she was going to become a journalist, it would be to break these norms. So the things that drove her into journalism, the ones that frustrated her, the kind of culture of fear and silence, she had to break them. So she had to write under her own byline and wouldn't shy away from writing about people who she knew socially, or who she was kind of aligned with politically.
She became a little bit jaded about the possibility of change in the later years. I think you write that she wrote that she had come to the conclusion that Maltese culture placed no value on free expression.
Yes.
And it's partly because of the size of the country that, again, you write in the book that in a small country, you're never very far from your enemies.
Yes.
So you're not merely writing about people you know, you're making enemies of those people.
Yes, that's right.
And in a sense, it's a wonder that you chose to follow her, because we mentioned in the introduction, but it's worth repeating. A lot of the things that happened as a way of trying to stop your mother writing were things that, I mean, perhaps in a city they wouldn't be less shocking, but perhaps you could brush them off more easily.
Yes.
But in a small country, in a small environment where you almost certainly, for example, when we're talking about somebody slit the throat of the family dog, your front door was set on fire, there was abusive graffiti about your mother. But those were also put in a context where you kind of almost certainly knew who did it.
Yes, that's right.
You may not have known them individually, but you would recognize them on the street.
Yes, that's right. And you know, in the first two cases you mentioned, our dog having her throat slit and the first arson attack on our house, and those were connected to a drug trafficker my mother was writing about. And the drug trafficker's brother was one of my mother's best friends, you know, until she started covering that story. And we were at school with his nephews, the trafficker's nephews. So it was very much that kind of place. I mean, I remember it, right? My mother would take us to a restaurant, say, and you'd sit at a table and look over to the next table, and it would be someone my mother had written about.
Right.
And life was completely like that. And you know, when you're a child, it matters less to you. I think when I became a teenager, it did start to affect me because, teenagers tend to be selfish, and you think, God, she's making my life so hard. And so there was that. But then by the time I got to university, I did think it's the country. The problem isn't the journalism. The problem is the subject of the journalism. And it's because I have a experience of that environment, that really oppressive, really close environment. To me, working in London is hugely liberating in a way that I find difficult to express to people who grew up here or grew up in a city.
Yeah.
And especially being a journalist here, as a kind of person who didn't grow up here, it's hugely liberating. Because in Malta you are, I suppose, like in most places, you're categorized by class, by language in Malta, by political party. It's a very tribal place. Whereas here, none of those assumptions are made about me. No one gets an email or a call from me and thinks, oh, he belongs to that party, or he's part of that class, or he went to the wrong school, or whatever. And I've always found that hugely liberating and so much easier to life in Malta, frankly.
You say this in the book, that you moved to London when you were 20, and you say that you loved that the parks were greener, that the air was cooler,
yes,
and that you weren't always bumping into people you knew.
Yes.
That's a big part of it, especially as a young person. But then I think also, wasn't it that you had this anonymity in London that
yes,
you didn't
that's
have
right. That's
at home?
Right.
Especially an anonymity maybe from the legacy of your mother. And
that is right. And it was the first time in my life that I really felt I could make a life for myself, my own life. Because the truth is, even if I stayed in Malta and hadn't followed my mother into journalism or my father into law, I would still have been that person,
right.
Daphne's sons, they
right.
used to call us.
Right.
And, that would have been my primary identity, and everything I did would have been shaped by it, affected by it. And I remember, in fact, when, the first year or so I lived in London, when she'd visit, I used to find it quite tiresome because I felt like London was my private space.
This is your space.
Yeah, and the anonymity was a wonderful thing, really, because, again, it's hard to express to people who grew up in big cities or big countries. But in a place like Malta, there's very little concept of private space.
Right. And you get, in those societies, I mean, like most people, have some experience with these smaller societies, and they tend to define you by your parents, by your brothers, because you're the youngest of the three.
Yes.
By what they did.
Yes,
exactly. You're the brother of so-and-so, he did this thing 10 years ago, and you go...
Yes, I know, and I always found that quite difficult. A lot of people like it, and I make no judgment on that at all. It can be a very comfortable place to grow up, but it was just not for me. I think that experience I mentioned of sitting on a beach when I was 18 was I suppose where it first set in. I remember feeling quite panicked by the idea that my life was literally. I remember following the coastline and thinking, this is it. This is the border of my life.
Yeah, especially as an island.
Yes, exactly. And that's, when I started seriously thinking,
about leaving.
This is not for me. But then here I am, following a career that was very obviously defined by my mother, writing about her, talking about her, but at least in my own way.
We should talk about your mother's death. The violence that we talked about in that world, which was kind of escalating, it reached a crescendo October 2017, almost exactly 7 years ago. Yeah. And you've said in other interviews that not only do you remember the date, you remember the time exactly.
Yes.
Your mother was assassinated by a remotely detonated car bomb that blew her car 50 meters into the air, and it killed her instantly. Where were you when you heard that news?
So I was in London. I was working at a friend's house in West London, and Malta's an hour ahead of us. And I remember I had just had lunch with colleagues and then was walking with a cup of coffee back to my desk. And a Maltese number kept calling my phone really insistently. And I typically don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, especially if it's a Maltese number. And so I ignored it. And I thought, if a family member wanted to get in touch, I'd call my own number. Anyway, finally, I heard from my aunt that it was my eldest brother Matthew who had been trying to call. And that, of course, worried me. So I went into another room. I called him, and he said, and I have the strangest kind of memory of this moment, and many people who've been through a very traumatic experience would describe the same thing, that you think you're kind of looking at yourself from outside yourself, from the ceiling, say. And I remember Matthew just saying, look, there was a bomb in her car, and I don't think she made it. And time just completely slowed down in that moment. Like, there was so much space between each one of his words. And I just didn't know what to do or say. And I told him, what do I do? What do I do? And he told me, come home. Come home. And so this was after 3 p.m. Malta time. So the bomb was detonated a few minutes before 3 p.m. So after 2 p.m. London time. The next flight home, maddeningly, was around 8:30 from Heathrow. So there was this excruciating period where I cycled back home, because that was the fastest way to go home, just crying and completely distraught and confused, like a nutcase cycling across London. I lived in southwest London at the time. And then made it home, and then kind of kept checking the news, Maltese news sites, anxiously to see if there are updates. Until finally, it was time to get that flight from Heathrow. And it was my father and my 2 brothers picked me up, and my wife, from the airport. And she went to her parents. And I remember Matthew was dressed in a suit for reasons I explain in the book. And anyway, we drove home, and we grew up in the countryside, so there's one road leading to the village, and our house is off a lane that leads up to that road. And it's a very, an area that's full of kind of childhood memory for us, kind of opens up onto a valley. And I remember my father saying, listen, be prepared, because the valley is just completely lit up. We were now, past midnight in Malta, completely lit up with floodlights and covered with soldiers, forensic officers, police officers. And I remember that scene, the kind of road dips, and it was all, like he said, lit up, and forensic officers wearing those white bodysuits. The car was still being examined in the field. We couldn't go anywhere near it. The area was completely sealed off. So we went straight to the house, and soon after, the 2 homicide detectives assigned to her case turned up to ask us some questions. And we really didn't leave the house much until we had to go to court for a libel hearing about a week later.
This may be a hard question, but did you ever consider the possibility that your mother might be killed in this way because of her work?
I think we all did. I think we all felt it. I think we, especially over the last 4 years of her life, it looked like things were headed in a really, really ugly direction. But at the same time, there was this kind of counterpoint where she had become so influential, so widely followed, widely read, that the idea of harming her physically seemed so extraordinary at the same time. And I think those two things played off each other, the intensifying campaign of harassment and abuse, and at the same time her influence. And
it kind of shielded her, perhaps.
Yes,
slightly,
that's right.
It seemed like it might.
We made the mistake of thinking that provided some protection. They wouldn't go that far. They wouldn't be that mad. But then what none of us knew, and what all of us now know, thanks to the public inquiry, the criminal proceedings, is just how totally rotten the state was, how totally corrupted every institution was, and had we known the extent of it, had she known the extent of it, of course, she'd have left the country, I imagine. We certainly at points encouraged her to leave. But we just had no real idea of how rotten things were. We thought we knew. We really thought we knew. But it's still being peeled back to this day.
Right. One of the things that, you strike me as being quite a private person. And it must be strange that so much of your life has become public. Even when you were describing the road to where you live. I mean, I've seen pictures of it, I've seen maps of it, and it's sort of strange. Like, that's your childhood home, you grew up there. And does that, away from the murder, does that strike you as something that has also affected you? That now people know all of these parts of your life when you were trying to live this anonymous life in London?
It has been a big change. We were, believe it or not, we were an intensely private family. I kind of avoided returning home and would only, do a few things, see very close friends, see my family when I did go home. I wasn't all over the internet like I am now. And of course, my jobs had no public kind of aspect to them, really. But you just had to give it up, And we realized after the murder, no one is going to do the campaign for us. No one is going to file these cases. No one is going to go around trying to raise awareness. And we just had to kind of accept that things were going to change permanently. And that's been very difficult. It's been very difficult for me. It's been very difficult for our extended family. And even the book, right? The book took me long to write, in large part because it took me long to accept I had to be very open, not just about my mother, but myself, my family.
You put yourself out there, I think, more than the rest of the family. I mean, you've become the kind of, the figurehead of it.
And my eldest brother as well, who is in court a lot and runs the foundation. But we've all had to kind of say, this is it now. There's no point in pretending we can return to whatever lives we had.
You seemed like you were very keen to make sure that she wasn't only perceived as a victim.
Yes.
That you wanted people to know the nuances of her story, but also how her story fits into the wider Maltese story.
Yes.
Was that, it must have been kind of a big shock, because you are, from trying to avoid being part of this story, you are now the story.
Yes.
You suddenly become this person telling your own mother's story, telling your story.
Yes. So it is a huge shock, because my life in London was all about separating my work, my social life, every part of my life from things that were happening in Malta. So so not existing as purely as Daphne's son, and not being seen in that way, feeling free to pursue whatever interests I wanted. And I know my friends here, I never spoke to them about my mother or Malta, of course, but suddenly after the murder, it's all I speak about. And I'm kind of giving interviews in the papers, on TV, on radio stations, and so it's a sudden dramatic shift, and strange for me, and I imagine strange for a lot of people around me, who
people who remembered you before.
Yes, exactly.
For the audience who perhaps don't know the details of the background to your mother's killing, I should explain this a little bit, and we should talk about it. Your mother was killed seemingly for trying to identify the owner of a certain company, 17 Black.
Yes.
As part of that investigation that you conducted into her death, you and your partners, you uncovered the corruption that went all the way to the top of Maltese society.
Yes.
Just outline for me what that investigation ultimately discovered.
Sure. So it started like this. In 2016, the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, received an enormous leak, now known as the Panama Papers, from a Panamanian offshore financial services firm called Mossack Fonseca. As it happens, my eldest brother Matthew worked for the ICIJ as a software engineer, and it was his job to make that leak machine readable and searchable. The ICIJ works by partnering with media organizations in different countries, and it partnered with the paper my mother used to write for, the Malta Independent. My mother started searching for names, Maltese names, of course, in that leak. And she started with two names. One, Conrad Mitzi, who was a cabinet minister responsible for energy and privatization projects. And the other name was Keith Schembri, who was the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. Prime Minister was Joseph Muscat, who had been elected in 2013. So my mother found they were present in the leak, and that they had both acquired Panamanian companies within a week of being elected to government in 2013. So at the same time, using the same accountants and the same kind of structure. So Panamanian companies owned by trusts in other offshore jurisdictions. So she published that information in February 2016, and there were protests and there was outcry, but nothing officially happened, right? The Prime Minister protected them, they remained in post, and my mother continued working, obviously, on that story. She wanted to know what those companies were for. She just knew they were there, but she didn't know why they had been set up, whether they were connected to a government project or so on.
Because these are shell companies, so
they
it's
were
not
shell
obvious.
companies.
It's not
yes.
easy to penetrate.
Exactly. So she only learned about their ownership by these officials because they were in this leak, right? In any other event, she'd have never been able to know who owned them, when they had been set up, or really anything about them.
Right.
In fact, in 2017, she got a tip about another shell company, only this one was registered in the United Arab Emirates. So it was not in the Panama Papers leak in a way that allowed her to see its owner. But the tip was that it was somehow connected to these two Panamanian companies. The company was called 17 Black, and in February 2017, weirdly, a year after she published the Panama Papers story, she said, look, there's a company called 17 Black, it's a UAE company, and it's connected to these officials. And she began trying to uncover who owned this company, because she saw it as the key, to understanding this wider, what looked like a wider corruption scheme. Of course, she was working on many other stories at the same time. So that was February 2017. She never found out who owned 17 Black because in October 2017 she was killed. One of the things my brothers and I did after she was killed was share a lot of her material with journalists initially at The Guardian and Reuters so that they could carry on her work. In April 2018, this group of journalists widened out. They began calling themselves the Daphne Project, and they started publishing stories. One of their first stories was on really suspicious financial dealings around a huge energy privatization contract, which involved completely changing Malta's energy sector and the construction of a new power station. And it looked like the Panamanian companies were connected to this project. Still nothing on 17 Black. Up until November 2018, when that same group of journalists, in this case specifically Reuters and the Times of Malta, found that 17 Black was owned by Jürgen Fenech. Now, there's real significance there in that Jürgen Fenech is also the man who won that energy privatization contract. A contract that was awarded to him really by two individuals, Konrad Mitzi and Keith Kembry, the owners of the Panamanian companies.
Right.
So from November 2018, it looked like that was the scheme. They award him the contract, he kicks back proceeds to them, all via
those two companies.
Yes, that's right. And nothing really was happening in the murder investigation publicly anyway, except that 3 hitmen had been arrested on the strength of very, very, very strong forensic evidence. What many people didn't know is the investigation had identified a middleman who was, aside from the murder, I should say, connected to Fenech. And there's this weird symmetry in that investigation finally in November 2019, a year after Fenech had been identified as 17 Black's owner, was arrested on suspicion of the murder. Quite dramatically trying to leave Malta on his yacht from a private marina his family had built.
And even the Prime Minister resigned.
Yes, that's right. So there was a really extraordinary moment in Maltese history where civil society has been really absent, right? Movements were either organized by the church or one of the major political parties. But one of the great things that happened since the murder was the growth in civil society in Malta. And after Fenech's arrest on suspicion of murder, suddenly everything became clear, you know? The narrative the government had been pushing that it was just a murder, you know, they said it wasn't an assassination, it certainly wasn't connected to the government, fell apart.
Right.
Because the motive for the murder existed in this corruption scheme, which was obviously a government corruption scheme, right? It was two very senior officials awarding a huge contract to
Right.
it. So the picture emerged, you know, this was very serious organized crime. A Maltese oligarch working with very senior officials in the government, a cabinet minister and the prime minister's right-hand man, to corrupt a major contract, public contract, and as far as Fenech is concerned, commission a car bombing of the country's most significant journalist who was reporting on him. And so Fenech was arrested, charged, and has been in custody ever since, awaiting trial. That same month, the government was obviously under enormous pressure. There were protests, unlike the country had ever seen, really, day and night across the country, outside the Prime Minister's office, outside Parliament. People were blocking roads, until finally the cabinet just kind of fell apart. It just collapsed. It became utterly unsustainable for Muscat to carry on because his right-hand man had been implicated, not just in this privatization contract, but in what became apparent, a very extensive and long-running attempt to cover up the murder. So Schembri learned of Fenwick's involvement almost immediately after the murder and began leaking information from the investigation directly to Fenwick, and very determinedly tried to help Fenwick corrupt the murder investigation, really from the start up until 2019 and beyond, actually.
There are still people under investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those things that it's been 7 years since the murder and it isn't really finished.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those things that's difficult, when we're having an interview like this, that almost you want the story to end, but it hasn't really ended yet.
It hasn't ended yet. So in kind of formal terms, the 3 hitmen have now all pleaded guilty.
Right.
So one got a 15-year sentence. He had a smaller role to play. He pleaded guilty very early on in exchange for evidence. The other 2 hitmen pleaded guilty the day their jury trial was to start. They got 40 years each. And a middleman, in exchange for evidence, was given a complete pardon. There are 3 men charged with supplying the bomb, and they're awaiting trial as well. And Fenwick is awaiting trial. We haven't seen any prosecutions over the attempted cover-up, which is a serious crime in Maltese law, right? It involves leaking state secrets. We have, and this is really significant for Malta, we have now started seeing prosecutions over the corruption stories. So one other major privatization deal was over our healthcare sector. And a few months ago, before summer this year, a major inquiry finally led to charges against Muscat, right, the former prime minister, which is a huge moment in Maltese history. So the first former prime minister to ever face criminal charges in a country that's littered with corrupt prime ministers. And also a lot of former and at the time current cabinet ministers were also charged over this privatization deal. And that's a major moment, right? Because in a country where corruption is endemic, where the country's institutions, its judiciary, police force, have always really struggled to operate independently from the executive, are now finally showing they've matured. And again, it is the first moment since 1964 where they are doing that.
Do you feel in some way that you've, as I say, the investigations are not finished, but do you feel in some way that you've gained closure over the murder of your mother?
I feel closure in the sense I know what happened. I know who did what. Of course, I don't know what will happen in court. No one ever does. And it might go horribly wrong. I'm always telling myself it might. But the most horrible period after the murder was this period when we had no names, We had no names.
Yeah.
It could have been any one of her stories. We always knew it was obviously related to her journalism. But she was working on so many stories. I mean, I talked about the Panama Papers, but there were many others. She worked on the sale of Maltese passports, a bank that operated as a laundromat. There were countless stories, really.
Have you now, in your subsequent work, now you're in London, you've been looking at Russian money and things like this. Have you seen overlaps in the way that you used to understand the corrupt system in Malta, even if you didn't know the extent of it fully, and what you see around you in a city the size of London?
I do. I mean, of course, it's a matter of degrees. I would never say corruption. I'm thinking about the Boris Johnson years. Corruption then had anything to do with the corruption like you see in Malta. I mean, in states like Malta, you're talking about state capture, right? You're talking about proper organized crime, an organization of individuals who managed to take control of the state to further their own interests. But the interesting thing for me was I started working as a journalist, doing investigations really when Johnson became Prime Minister here. And I remember thinking how interesting that a lot of the big stories of that era really came down to the same issue we have in Malta, a very, very powerful executive, a prime minister who has so much power to make public appointments, to award contracts, to prorogue parliament here. And I thought, of course, it's no coincidence. We inherited those constitutional structures, right? In 1964, we were left with them and we never changed them. And ours were even worse, really, because instead of a prime minister, we had a colonial governor. And our prime minister just became that. Someone who could appoint members to the bench, hire and fire police commissioners.
But I suppose you start to see, I like you, I don't want to start saying that there's an exact parallel. But we had the writer Oliver Boulot on the podcast talking about...
I know Oliver. He's great. Yeah.
And he writes a lot about the way that London has allowed some of the world's wealthiest people to bring their money here.
Yes, and that was a huge lesson I think people here have now started to learn. I remember when we started campaigning late 2017, especially over 2018, it still felt like saying things like, look, offshore companies are a huge issue and they are happening in British overseas territories. They're being enabled by accountants, lawyers, bankers here in London. It still felt not quite fringe, but thereabouts.
Right,
it just didn't feel
something far away. What has that got to do with it? What is this conspiracy talk about?
Simply put, it wasn't important to enough people here.
Yeah,
I think here it really started changing when Russia invaded Ukraine, and people started looking around them in London and thinking about oligarchy and the presence of Russian oligarchy in London, the houses, the yachts, the football clubs.
Yeah.
I think that's when a lot of people started thinking about it. But I mean, Oliver's book is the best expression of the issue, that Britain was looking for this role, a post-imperial role, and then found it in a really strange way in the remnants of its empire, that it worked with these former colonies, many of them offshore havens, to kind of create a new economy where it would launder the corruption in these states, and that's what it was, a butler to the world.
Butler to the world, in the phrase of his book, yeah. You don't think that the corruption is on the same scale, but you see the way that it could easily end up in that direction. Not as far, but in that direction. As you say, you have a strong executive. It has the ability to make these appointments with very minimal oversight. Or if there is oversight, the oversight comes years later.
Yes, exactly. So there's one story I did about one of Johnson's appointments to the House of Lords. A man called Evgeny Lebedev, who before this story was seen as a slightly comical figure, a bit odd but fun and harmless. So his father was a KGB officer who became one of the first, the early 90s oligarchs, the less famous ones, less wealthy than, say, Abramovich, but still very wealthy, at a point a billionaire. His father's wealth allowed Evgeny to buy the Evening Standard newspaper and the Independent, and so Evgeny became quite influential and significant here, and very friendly with Johnson. And that story was commissioned the Christmas before Russia invaded Ukraine, and my editor James Harding told me, look, I think this is a really shocking story, but at the time we only really saw it as an abuse of the Prime Minister's power to make appointments to the Lords,
right?
Which is a crazy constitutional a
Crazy.
really extraordinary thing.
And Johnson has appointed some very strange people.
Yes, that's right.
In other contexts. Lebedev, I think, also had the same.
Lebedev was a very,
suggestions.
very interesting story because the advice there was national security advice, which we learned said, we really don't like this plan. Ultimately because of Evgeny's father,
Right.
Alexander, who
has maintained close links with the Kremlin.
Yes, and is now very openly pro-Putin, right? He lives in Moscow and is unembarrassed by the association. But again, this was all before the invasion of Ukraine.
It's taken on a very different meaning and flavor since the invasion of Ukraine.
That's right. So anyway, that national security advice was ignored. So we learned that, advice went to the House of Lords Appointments Commission, which can advise against appointments but can't veto them. Johnson ignored it. The security service, so MI5, sent 2 officers to Downing Street to tell Johnson, we really don't like this plan. He ignored that as well and made the appointment. And then, of course, in February 2022, Russia launched, I should say, its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And suddenly everyone started thinking quite differently about stories like that. And we, just by chance really, I wish I could take credit for the timing, but we published around that time. Published 3 or 4 days after the invasion, the full-scale invasion, and the story changed character. It wasn't simply, the Prime Minister makes a sleazy appointment to the Lords, which had happened in the past many times, and people were kind of really, I suspect, quite bored by those stories. They didn't think the Lords were significant. They thought, whatever, all prime ministers do this.
Right.
But then what Evgeny revealed is, look how bad that constitutional power is.
Yeah.
Look how bad it is, because now you've ended up in a situation where Russia has launched this full-scale war with a European country, and we all know how Russian oligarchy works. We all know how former KGB officers are close to Putin, and you've got a former KGB officer's son in the Lords for life. And that was allowed by the country's constitutional setup.
At the same time as laws are being made to send
Yes.
money and weaponry to fight
That's right.
Russia.
And of course, Evgeny would say, I have nothing to do with my father. I'm a separate person. I have nothing to do with the FSB. But why generate that risk,
Yeah. Especially when what we're talking about separately from the individual is the structure that allows the Prime Minister to do that.
That's right.
To make these appointments.
Yes, that's right. And the same powers that allowed Johnson to make Evgeny's appointment could have allowed him to make Alexander, the father's appointment. He might have done that for all we knew he was thinking about it. And it's those vulnerabilities that I became very interested in. And we stretched that story out to a whole podcast series, which took off. I mean, I think people really weren't asking those questions, of the government here.
I wanted to finish by asking you a little bit about, something that occurred to me. When you talked about this podcast that you made, and I know a Reuters journalist made a podcast about your mother's
Stephen Gray, yes.
Before. And I wondered if part of the reason for writing the book and for making this podcast yourself is that in some way you want to take ownership of the legacy.
Yes.
You want to kind of have someone who knew her and loved her telling the story yourself.
Yes. It was a big part of that. I think the main thing though was that her murder had become so much bigger than her life, and she existed to most people as a journalist who had been car bombed, and that was very a lot of things to me, but very sad that people didn't know just how extraordinary she was and how much she had to overcome to become a journalist in the first place, and what a really wonderful mother, actually. She was to me and my brothers. And no one else could have told that story, you know. It had to be me or my brothers, and they left me alone with it. So I wanted to do that, and I quite early on, though, I began learning a lot about her that I never knew.
Yeah.
And so
we never really know our parents, do we?
No, we don't.
They exist as...
And I realized how little I knew, actually. Like, why did she become a journalist? Exactly when did she start writing? I never really asked my father about what being married to her was like, or my grandparents what raising her was like. And so the book became its own reward to me in that I was learning all those things. But yes, a big part of it was also setting it down in my own words, like a first-person narrative. And so that would exist, you know, as a document people could turn to.
It's a strange thing, I think, because we talk so much about your mother, and you really have become a kind of someone who has taken on her legacy further. I wonder sometimes if, in addition to mourning her death, do you ever mourn your own previous life? Because it sent you on a different trajectory.
Yes, I do miss aspects of it. I mean, look, if I could reverse the whole business, I would. But I can't. And I've always told myself there are many things you could do to compound the tragedy. One of them would be to retreat and live a lesser life, you know, and just feel sorry for yourself and your family. But I was very determined to do something very constructive and positive, and that came in the form of journalism. And I feel the work I do now is that, you know, it again brings me great joy, really, is the word, I think. And maybe that will change one day. I don't know if it will. But no, I do miss the privacy.
The anonymity.
Yes, but that's not coming back.
I'm sure other people have asked you this, but what do you think your mother would make of the career and the life that you've built now?
I think she'd find it quite funny, really, because I was so resistant to a career in journalism. But I don't know. I like to think she'd find it a good thing, you know, that it is in tribute to her, and that, I mean, the book is obvious, but also all the other stories I do are an attempt to do her the honor of saying, look, your example is one I want to live by, and I am certainly trying to. And then she would tell me I need to shave, wear a shirt, wear a jacket, wear a tie. I should look more like you, Faisal.
Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. Keith Schembri and Jürgen Fennick deny all the allegations against them. Paul Caruana Galizia's book, A Death in Malta, is out now in paperback and available in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.